Our final genetics video is going to be on pedigrees. Pedigrees are basically like a family tree, and there's some rules that you need to learn that are on your target sheet, so we'll go over them here. Females are always shown as circles and males are always shown as squares. The trait that we're tracking, which is usually a recessive trait, is always shown by shading in an individual. And then we give the generations Roman numeral numbers while we give the individuals just regular numbers. So I'll show you how to do that. Each generation would get a Roman numeral, so we could put that over here on the side. This is generation 1. This is generation 2, and this is generation 3. And then every individual within each generation is given a regular number, so this would be individual 1 and 2. We start over in the next generation, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then down here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this way we can talk about the individual people because I can say it's in generation 2, individual 3 is affected by this trait, and individual in generation 3, individual 3 is also affected by the trait. So you can be given a problem that could be worked out in a Punnett square or could be worked out in a pedigree, and sometimes we'll ask you to use the pedigree to solve. This particular problem is looking at night blindness. So we have the dominant trait of normal vision and the recessive trait of night blindness. It asks you to write the genotypes of all the individuals below their symbol in the pedigree, and it asks what would happen if two of these individuals were to marry and have children, what possible genotypes might the children have. So the first thing I want to do is go through and label my generations so I know I'm doing that correctly. So I have here generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, and generation 4. And I'm going to go through and fill in the genotypes for as many of the individuals as I possibly can. Now, the easiest thing to do is start with the recessive individuals because we know that they're going to be little n, little n. For every other person on this pedigree, what I know is that they could be this. I don't know until I go look for some information if they're homozygous dominant or if they're heterozygous. Now, you understand at this point that if an individual has a homozygous recessive child or parent, we could then determine that their genotype would be heterozygous. So for some of these individuals, we'll be able to go back through and fill them in. For example, individual 1-1 right here, we know this person has to be heterozygous because they had a little n to donate to their daughter. Also, in the second generation, individuals 2 and 3 we can determine would be heterozygous because the only thing that their mother had to donate to them was that little n. So anyone that has a parent or a child who's homozygous recessive, we can go back through and we can fill them in. Every other individual on this chart we cannot determine. You'd have to leave every other individual on this chart as n blank. We don't know what that other allele would be. Let's answer the second part of this problem. If individuals 2-2, so this person right here, and 2-8 were to marry and have children, what would the possible genotypes of any children they might have? So you can do a Punnett square for this if you want to. You might be able to do this in your head at this point. Big N. So it looks like 50% of their children would be heterozygous for night blindness, and 50% of their children would be homozygous recessive and be night blind. Some pedigree problems get more complex, and they may ask you to determine something like this. Could this trait be inherited as autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant? Could this trait be inherited as a simple X-linked recessive trait? And so you need to start looking for patterns. For example, in this pedigree, neither of the parents have the trait, but the son is inheriting it. You have to think about if this would be a sex-linked trait. If it was a sex-linked trait, this son would have a genotype something like this. And you'd have to think about then what the parents would have. Well, that could make sense because the father wouldn't have to have the trait. The mother could have been a carrier and passed on that recessive trait to the son. The mother could have then passed on the dominant trait to this son, so this son could have had the dominant trait, and the daughters could have come here and been either carriers or just homozygous dominant for the trait. So could this trait be inherited as a simple X-linked recessive disease? Yes. You then would have to go through and solve to see if it could be inherited as a simple autosomal recessive trait or a autosomal dominant trait. Pause the video and see if you can figure out if either of those options would be true for this pedigree. Did you get the same answer as me? I was able to find a way to work this out so that the trait could be inherited as a simple autosomal recessive disease. If this individual was autosomal recessive, little n, it would make sense that the parents could both be heterozygous for the trait, pass it on to one of their children, but not the other three. For autosomal dominant, if this individual had to be, I worked that out over here, if the individual has to have a dominant trait to have the disorder, they have to be at least one large N. There's no way that neither of their parents could be affected because at least one of their parents would have to have that big N and then be shaded in.